Hello, everybody. Welcome to our regular session to Friday Talks with Steven Friedman. It's a great philosopher with whom you have a very interesting conversations related to the philosophy and philosophical perspectives and philosophical view on some issues. So welcome to this program. My name is Sherigol Karimova, and let me introduce Mr. Steven Friedman. Steven, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, I would like to thank everybody at the consulate, the American consulate, for making this possible, this series of talks. That includes Consul General Eric Meyer and the staff that has been working very closely with me. I appreciate this platform to present philosophical perspectives on contemporary issues. As philosophy tends to operate from a very sort of high level of generality, what I want to do is begin from sort of a broad perspective, and then we will focus ultimately upon the specific issue of the evening. But first, I want to develop a little bit of background that provides the framework for understanding certain approaches to problems in a deeper sense than you might find in most other fields. I wanted to begin very generally by telling you a brief story about the American mathematician John Nash. John Nash was a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He developed aspects to game theory that became very powerful in understanding all types of decision-making in complex systems. I once saw, and he was actually also featured in the film, A Beautiful Mind, a number of years ago, that received a lot of favorable attention. John Nash's story is also complicated by the fact that he had a type of schizophrenia. He suffered from acute mental illness, a psychotic type of mental illness throughout much of his creative life, but was able to achieve significant mathematical results despite that difficulty, that challenge. I once saw a biography on John Nash, and a number of mathematicians were talking about him and his work. And what they commented on in particular was that whereas other mathematicians tended to ascend up a problem that presented itself through some kind of arduous trek up a mountain to try to achieve some clarity, some understanding, John Nash took invariably the opposite approach. He would descend on a problem. So he would approach the problem from a very broad perspective that allowed him to see the overall landscape in which the problem presented itself, that allowed him to achieve solutions that eluded the work of other mathematicians. Well, philosophy has that similar characteristic. It approaches things from a very high, the highest of all levels of generality. And when I say high level of generality, what I mean is that philosophical propositions apply to everything. They apply to every type of object. And they operate both at the highest level of generality and the highest level of specificity. That is captured by the characterization of philosophy as operating at the limit of rigor. And one of the things that we've been developing is this notion of rigor as being a matter of recognizing the importance of differences, that the space in which we exist is the existential space is characterized by differences between every object, every point. Now, those differences may only be differences of position. that's enough to mean that what applies to any one point does not necessarily rigorously apply to any other. That's ultimately the basis, not just of our existence as things independent of other things, but our dignity, that we are fundamentally singular in our experience, in our characterization, and it's that singularity, that radical distinction, that means that whatever is true of any one individual need not be true of any other. That includes broad concepts like mortality, disease, old age, death. You might ask yourself, in what type of world can we imagine a world in which death was not certain? That's this world. And it's this world because of what distinguishes each moment and each point from every other. And a single difference is enough to undercut a claim that one would like to make about one thing being the same as something else. I sometimes like to summarize this by saying that we are, objects are, existent things are approximately the same, rigorously different. Now, in an existential space, a space that's characterized by each point being singular and different from everything else, that describes a philosophic space. The alternative to that is what I call a heuristic space. A heuristic space is characterized by similarities between things, things that are clustered or grouped together by the concepts that we use. Concepts are bringing things together, grouping things based upon similarities for some purpose. An existential, a philosophic, a rigorous space I call epistemic. That's a space characterized by distinction between points, by divergence between 2 points. A heuristic space is characterized by convergence, things coming together. If you look at an object like a tree, a table, anything presenting in the objective world, what you'll see is things that we are clustering together based upon past experience, present sensation, future expectation. Those constitute elements or objects in heuristic space. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned previously is that the work of preeminent physicists like Einstein and Heisenberg try to describe the world from within the world, because it's not possible for us to extricate ourselves from this experience. We have to describe the world from where we are. Most scientists think of science as picturing a reality as if we were seeing it from outside. But the work of Einstein and Heisenberg in particular is an attempt to really do the physics of existentialism, where existentialism recognizes the impossibility of leaving the world to view it from the outside. Now, the fundamental meaning, significant of the work of Einstein is that each point, each individual is the still center of existence, so far as we could ever know. And the equations of his physics make it possible for us to describe the world as if each individual was the still center of experience. For us not to be the still center, we would have to be able to see ourselves from outside, remove ourselves from experience. That's impossible. When I sometimes address the question, I think we talked about this previously, that we're supposedly on an Earth that's rotating and that's revolving around the sun, rotating at 1,000 miles an hour, revolving around the sun at 66 or 67,000 miles an hour. The question is, why don't we feel that we're moving? And the answer given previously from the time of Galileo up until Einstein was this principle of inertia. Well, The principle of inertia just says that we don't feel that we're moving because we don't feel that we're moving, if we're moving. That's really not a deep characterization of the circumstance. The Einsteinian answer is the reason we don't feel that we're moving, each and every individual, is that we're not. Because philosophically, in order to make the claim that we are, again, is a claim outside experience. Now, because we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside, each of us can be represented as a universal convergence, where each of us can be thought of as summarizing the universe at the point at which we find ourselves. Universal convergence is, one can sort of demonstrate, the condition, the heuristic condition of existence itself. And it's what links the epistemic to the heuristic. I know that might sound that's a little abstract, a little difficult, but we'll develop the significance of that, in due time. But what I wanted to sort of connect that with is two ideas, one of which will give you kind of a broader understanding of what I'm saying, and the other will link it to specifically tonight's topic. The question of meaning serves as an illustration of some of these ideas. When we ask ourselves, for example, the meaning of a poem, we're looking for that statement or representation that all the individual components of the poem converge on. We want that explanation, that summary that explains all the elements of the poem. That, and again, expressing that through this term of convergence, all the things come together, focus on that one specific summary. That becomes the meaning of the poem. The meaning of the poem has to account for, has to explain, has to represent the convergence of all the individual parts, elements of that object. The same thing applies more broadly to our lives. The meaning of our lives is that representation, that expression, that statement upon which all the energies, the events, the experiences, the efforts of our life converge. The meaning of the world is that, again, representation, statement, expression upon which all the features of experience universally converge. The concept of God partakes of this same notion of universal convergence. And again, this is the final thing before we get closer to tonight's topic specifically. You often hear people representing themselves as atheists in that they will reject the notion of an anthropomorphic God, a God that is conceived in human terms as some type of guiding intelligence or spirit, to experience. That's not the deep aspect of the concept of God. When someone claims that they're an atheist, they're actually most likely misrepresenting their position, their relationship to the world. Most people that represent themselves, describe themselves in that way, at the same time as they are rejecting this concept of God, are embracing a variety of things as good and things worthy to pursue. For example, such an individual might think that health is good, or wealth is good, or beauty is good, or fame is good, or a comfortable house or residence or family. Those are all good things to be desired, pursued, and, if possible, achieved. Well, that describes not the position of an atheist, but of a polytheist. A polytheist is an individual for whom a variety of things are independently good, worth pursuing, but fundamentally distinguishable from each other. So that one can pursue health or wealth, but one can pursue the one independently of the other. One can pick and choose among goods to pursue. The concept of a God, of theism, is of a universal convergence. God is, if you have a relationship to God, believe in a God, you believe not that health is good or wealth is good or beauty is good, but that God is good, and all of those other features of experience are good in relation to God. All things converge upon God. God represents a universal convergence. The reason that God as a concept can embody the meaning of the world is that meaning itself is the universal convergence of all the elements of experience. God is the universal convergence of all the elements of experience. Therefore, meaning and God are functioning in the same way at the same level. They themselves converge, and so God embodies meaning. The notion that each of us is a universal convergence, that the entire universe can be mapped mathematically to where we are right here, right now, that we can be said to summarize the world, the universe at this point, means that, again, we can represent each of us as a universal convergence. We are different from each other because the universe is converging at distinguishable points. And those distinguishable points, I'm here, you're there, is enough to distinguish one from the other. But just as each individual can be a universal convergence, God can be seen as a universal convergence. Therefore, we can say that, as the Hindus say, metaphorically, Atman, the soul of the individual, is Brahman, the soul of the universe. It's simply a metaphorical way of saying what the logic of convergence allows us to say. And the logic of convergence ultimately is based upon the fact that we cannot leave the world to view the world. Now, one other kind of distinction I'd like to make. I know these concepts, heuristic and epistemic, the philosophic, the non-philosophic are abstract and unfamiliar to most people. One of the ways to make it concrete is, if you look around, the objects you see, whatever those objects are, they can be, furniture, they can be, scenes in nature, elements of nature, and other individuals. All of those things that you see and that you describe and that you name represent elements of heuristic space. They are things that are being clustered together, convergent entities based upon previous experience and a lot of factors that are behind the convergent process. What characterizes the asymmetry of the space, the fact that the world is different in different directions, that represents, if you like, the manifestation of the epistemic. So the epistemic is the asymmetry, the heuristic is the recognizably objective, the objects we can identify. Again, I know this will be unfamiliar to a lot of you. We'll develop it over time. And I keep going back to some of these fundamental issues so that they do become familiar over time in different contexts. Now, tonight we're talking about issues of food loss, waste management. We are talking basically within a biological setting. We are talking about biological, ecological phenomena. So we want to approach this from a broader perspective of the biological sciences to get a deeper handle on this and see what some approaches to solutions to various issues that are raised by this topic what various approaches might present themselves. Within biology, the most convergent result, and by convergent, I mean that which explains the most, that representation upon which all biological phenomena converge, is the theory of evolution. And let me say a few things about the theory of evolution, because that is fundamental to our thinking about any biological process, including any process that relates to human beings as living organisms, as part of the sphere of life. And the sphere of life set within an environmental context. There's a Russian-American evolutionary biologist of the 20th century, earlier in mid-20th century, who said famously and wrote an article, entitled, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Now, that's an illustration of how that theory happens to be highly convergent. It explains everything. It's actually one of the greatest intellectual achievements in human history. It's the reason why Charles Darwin has the fame, has the status that he does. It is a monumental result. It first became available to the world in 1859. The work that Darwin published was On the Origin of Species. And let me say a little bit about, I'll give you a story about that. When I was in the 9th grade, in English class, we were studying late 19th century British literature. And we're reading authors like Thomas Hardy. Well, Thomas Hardy, writing in the late 19th century, was influenced, as many writers and creators in different fields were, by Darwin's work, by the theory of evolution, which again had appeared in 1859. The assignment in the class was to read a book, primarily in relation to Hardy or some of his contemporaries. Most people chose to read novels like Tests of the D'Urbervilles, a famous Thomas Hardy novel. I, having a scientific predilection at that time, chose to read On the Origin of Species, Darwin's work. It was one of the most important decisions, it turns out, I ever made. It's a difficult book, and it's a long book. But Darwin knew what he was likely to face in terms of the acceptance of his ideas. He knew that he was going to be presenting a position that ran counter to generations, centuries of human thought. He knew he was presenting a position that ran counter to the creationism of the Bible, of not just the Western Bible, but of other religious traditions as well. So he knew that he was going to meet resistance. Well, what is remarkable about On the Origin of Species is the mass of evidence Darwin presents for his results. It is overwhelming. And you don't even have to read all, well, the number of pages depends on the edition, right? All 500 pages or 600 pages. By the time I got to page 100, I was astonished at what I was reading. I'm actually reminded, as I say that, of Einstein's reaction when he encountered the work of Newton. He was overwhelmed by the detail, the capacity of Newton's mind. Well, I was overwhelmed by the amount of evidence that Darwin had marshaled for his ideas. If anybody has any doubt about the power and the validity as a theory, the potential as a theory, the success as a theory of the origin of evolution as presented in Darwin's work, just read On the Origin of Species. No matter what your religious beliefs are, having encountered that book, you will come away feeling that if you believe in a God, well, God clearly decided in his wisdom, or in her wisdom, or in its wisdom, that life would evolve according to the principles elaborated in on the origin of species. It's that compelling and that convincing. And before I go on with that direction of thought, that reminds me of something else. A few weeks ago, we were talking about education and about self-education, and I was giving some general guidelines. Well, one of the most valuable lessons that I took away from reading Darwin's original work, and that I recommend to you, is, in general, always go to the original creator if you want to understand the full nature and depth of the ideas. There is no better source for understanding Einstein's work than Einstein. There is no better person to read to be compelled by the theory of evolution than Charles Darwin. Every commentator, interpreter will present, in his or her sort of frame of reference, a way of understanding it. But I've always found that the most compelling, the most convincing, and the most complete exposure to any topic is through the work of its original developer. Okay, so you might want other perspectives as well, but the perspective of the original creator is invaluable and ultimately indispensable. Okay, so theory of evolution kind of guides our understanding of biological phenomena and our relationship to experience and the change of experience. Now, one of the things that emerges from Darwin's work and the work of biologists, since Darwin, is the idea that human beings were ultimately descended from an arboreal form, that our evolutionary ancestors, predecessors, lived in trees, and that 3 million years ago, 4 million years ago, something on that order, we transitioned from life in trees to life on the ground. We transitioned from an arboreal life to a terrestrial life. What we are as human beings, distinctively human, is primarily characterizable and relatable to what was involved in the transition from that capability of living within trees to the requirements for a bipedal existence, walking on 2 feet with a high center of gravity, where the high center of gravity means that we're fundamentally unstable. So we need a lot of musculature and a lot of neurophysiology to help control posture and achieve balance. We have a highly developed cerebellum, part of the brain that's involved in coordinating postural kinds of activities. It's one of the most robust parts of our brain. We have visual acuity that has to be adequate for seeing from an elevated height, the height of our eyes, anything on the ground that is small enough to pose a threat to us walking around on the ground, because if we step on something that's going to injure our feet, we can be, that's death, for early man, for early woman. So a lot of our capacities, our abilities are actually related to that transition. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this is going through school, and I still hear this in the media. There's an actress, Shailene Woodley, you may have heard of her, who actually shared an acting coach with me. I did a play a few years ago in New York, a play based on my philosophy, and I so admired Shailene Woodley's performances that I sought out her acting coach and I took instruction from her. Well, Shailene Woodley likes to talk about, as I once liked to talk about, the importance of the opposable thumb. That growing up, I read, I heard in school that the opposable thumb, the ability for us to grasp objects, tools with our thumb and fingers, was the key to our use of tools, our development ultimately of technology, along with the capacity of our brain, and ultimately the distinguishing factor in subsequent human evolution. It was the demarcation between human and previous forms of life. This is not true. Primates in general, chimpanzees, gorillas, have opposable thumbs. And in fact, this form of our hands is not designed for grasping tools. It's designed for grasping branches. These are chimpanzee hands, ape hands, if you like. It's not the hand that is the key to human evolution. It's not the opposable thumb. When we were arboreal, living in trees, just as other primates living in trees, we had opposable big toes. Our feet had grasping ability comparable to that of our hands. When we transitioned from trees to land, arboreal to terrestrial, the decisive evolutionary advance, or one that we can point to, is the loss of the opposable big toe. So now our big toe is aligned, and that achieves greater efficiency of walking on the ground. Now, when we arrived on the ground, we no longer needed the elaborate upper body musculature, the highly developed upper body musculature that characterizes, again, chimpanzees, for example, that makes it possible for them to climb trees and scurry through trees with an ease that is a challenge to human beings. We admire rock climbers. Eric Honnold is a famous free solo climber, somebody who climbs without ropes or other support. He was featured in a film, a documentary, Free Solo, that won Best Documentary a couple of years ago at the Academy Awards, at the Oscars. Eric Honnold is one of the most skilled, one of the most gifted climbers alive. But what he's able to do that is a challenge for human beings was trivial for our ancestors, because they had the upper body musculature that allowed them to navigate life in trees to a degree. So we've lost that. Now, another thing, the one mammal that, at least in Los Angeles, where I live, people encounter on a regular basis is the squirrel. I know the squirrel is pretty much now found throughout the world. The squirrel was actually indigenous studies show, or suggest at this point, to North America. And in fact, the first squirrels, the oldest fossil record of squirrels, goes back about 36, 40 million years ago to the Western United States. And since then, actually, there hasn't been that much evolutionary advance in squirrels. Squirrels, in fact, now are sometimes referred to as the monkeys of North America. They are, or some of the squirrels are arboreal. They live in trees. So they actually share certain characteristics with us. They have acute vision. They also have acute touch. It turns out that if you are living in a tree, you need touch and vision more than anything else. Your vision has to be characterized by high contrast. You have to be able to see, a strong distinction, a sharp distinction between branch and empty space, positive and negative space around it. We see the world in high contrast. Objects sort of are highly distinguishable to us against their ground. That is a legacy of life in trees. That is part of what we bear in ourselves to this day. Now, one of the things about, so basically vision and touch, like grasping branches, represent the two senses that constitute life and death for a creature living, in arboreal existence. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about squirrels is, in general, they tend not to gain weight, right? Because, I mean, they can, there are circumstances, but in general, when you're sort of operating in trees and you're ascending high in trees, large body fat, large amounts of body fat are deleterious. They can be fatal, right? They compromise your ability to run up. They compromise your ability to be supported on higher and higher branches. It's a threat. We, on the other hand, have the ability to gain weight. In fact, I just read today an interview with the original founder of Whole Foods, John Mackey. Whole Foods is now owned by Amazon, but originally it was an independent company. John Mackey was the founder, and he noted in the interview that the whole world is getting fat. Okay? Well, getting fat can be associated with a couple of features of our existence. First of all, we're on the ground now, so we can support like increased body weight. Okay? Part of that sort of evolutionary progression to life on the ground that can support that body weight meant that we did not develop, we might have, but we didn't develop the ability to sense our fat. We don't have within us, within our fat cells, what are called proprioceptors. We don't have nerve cells that can sense our fat deposits, our fat accumulations. Now, if it were important for us not to accumulate fat, we can imagine that we might have some type of feedback loops in our brain that would alert us to it. We might, as we got fatter and fatter, we might become itchy. We might find it painful. We might have developed certain types of physiological responses that would potentiate against the accumulation, of excess weight. As opposed to the species we now are, that is overly consuming, overly eating. We're in fact now, presumably one of the reasons why we don't have that internal sense that is a check, a direct physiological check on our gaining weight and our overly consuming, our eating more than we need in this kind of world where food is relatively plentiful, is probably 3 million years ago, 4 million years ago, food was more of a challenge. And so there was an advantage to being able to accumulate, like stores of it. We do not have the capacity to store oxygen. We don't need that capacity because oxygen is abundant around us, right? We can only go a few minutes deprived of oxygen. We don't store it. In general, we don't need to store it. Our environment provides it aplenty. Of course, the environment of Earth wasn't always in that way, right? And in the early development of life on Earth, the atmosphere had almost no oxygen. All of the oxygen was in rocks. It was only the development of photosynthetic organisms that brought oxygen into the air. And that is going to be a point that I'm going to come back to in terms of how all living things change their world, okay? But we also do not store significantly water. We can only go a couple of days without water. We can go a few minutes without oxygen, a couple of days without water. In general, human beings have had to, and human societies have developed where water was available. Most early civilizations developed on the banks of rivers where there was fresh water. So but there was enough such sources. I mean, after all, the surface of the earth is 70% water, not all fresh water, but enough fresh water to allow for the development of human beings that did not demand the capacity to store it, okay? But presumably, we did not have that abundance of food available. So we have the capacity to store it, and we lack the internal mechanisms that block our storing it for other purposes, like purposes maybe of health. Okay. Our circumstances are now, for most of the world, much of the world, fundamentally different than for primeval humans, where many contemporary cultures have an abundance of food available. We live with surplus food. If there are areas of Earth that do not have that type of abundance, it's really more a matter of distribution. We have, in principle, the capacity to make adequate food available even for 7 billion human beings. We certainly would have that capacity if people were not consuming at such a level that 2/3 of the US population is overweight or obese. So we are certainly, as human beings, operating in a way that was consistent, presumably, with an environment 2 million, 3 million years ago, but is not consistent with our environment today. That environment has changed. We genetically, evolutionarily, do not advance that rapidly. But an environment, especially when technology is operating, technology can amplify change. The technology of the Industrial Revolution made it possible for food to be grown and manufactured at levels that were unknown, right? The development of agriculture, as things are progressing, advances in molecular biology, manipulation of crops, crossbreeding of crops, like crossbreeding of animals, have all made food, in principle, available at levels that were unimaginable in our early evolutionary history. So, question is, how can we adapt ourselves? Because clearly it's a challenge, right? As John Mackey noted, and as most physicians, epidemiologists note the issue of weight gain, of excessive eating, of overconsumption, right? And overconsumption leads to excessive waste production. That issue is one of the fundamental issues confronting human beings. Now, it's possible to imagine genetic manipulations that might allow us to be more adapted to this environment, but human beings are not at, our science, our molecular biology is not close to that type of intervention. But we can use convergence theory to come up with a possible solution. And it's something actually that I've investigated, and it works for me. I've tested it on a small number of people, but it's compelling in the way that any approach or theory can be compelling if it is sufficiently convergent, if enough elements are coming together that make it a plausible response. And that's the following. What we require genetically, physiologically, to control internal processes, typically is what's called a feedback loop. We consume something, we undergo some physiological process, it produces a product, that product accumulates. When we have enough of that product, there's a mechanism that ultimately goes back and shuts off the beginning of that process. So we don't make more of what we need. We are efficient. Efficiency is extremely important as a concept in the realm of biology. And it's important ultimately because of the nature of evolution, evolutionary theory as elaborated by Darwin. The idea that we are in a highly competitive space. Living things are constantly competing. We're competing not just with other species, we're competing among ourselves, and we're competing in a world of limited resources, right? So, and we are steady state systems, which means that in order to maintain an internal equilibrium, we have to have things coming in and things going out. We're like steam engines in a way. The 19th century was devoted a lot to the development of thermodynamic theory that dealt with the theory of steam engines. Those are mostly steady state systems where fuel or food has to be inputted to satisfy the energy needs, whatever work, whatever activity the system is doing, the system being us. And then there's some amount of waste that's generated. And the nature of of thermodynamic analysis is such that you can't make a system 100% efficient. You're going to have, for some amount of energy input, some amount of useless waste in the form of heat or some other kind of waste result. Okay? And in fact, thermodynamics is the one branch of science that Einstein most admired. It was the branch of science that he felt would still be standing at the end of time, that no matter what other scientific developments or progress was made, thermodynamics would still be intact effectively as a discipline. That was partly because of the nature of its generality, certain features of it. And in fact, it's often been said too that at the end of the 19th century, the person who had the deepest understanding of thermodynamics was in fact Einstein, and that understanding was central to his work in cosmology and understanding the broader structure of the universe. But that's a different topic. Okay, so we're not going to re-engineer ourselves, not at this point, but we can do something comparable. We would like to create a feedback loop, okay? We would like to do something that could curtail or suppress our appetite under these conditions of abundance. Now, one of the reasons why we accumulate fat, why we overconsume, is that at some level, at some primal level, we are eating because we are preparing for scarcity, a time of scarcity. We're not sort of cognizant on an hourly or daily basis that we are not in danger. Physiologically, we're not cognizant of the fact that we are not in danger of starving to death. Not imminently so. There's enough food in our environment. We don't need to be overeating, but it's part of our deeper programming, if you like, to be sort of responding to the world as if scarcity of food was a constant threat. So the tendency is we overeat, we overconsume. And again, you overeat, you overconsume, you're going to produce excessive amount of waste. That's just in general. Okay, so our brain is not aware of our fat because we don't have proprioceptors, we don't have sensory neurons in our fat cells that are making us aware of that. We do not respond physiologically with pain or itching or something else that would curtail the consumption. What can we do? Well, our two most sensitive senses are vision and touch. Touch is not as vital to our survival now as it was when we were living in trees, but we retain sort of the sensitivity. We have a lot of sensory receptors that make touch inordinately sensitive as a sense based on, again, our evolutionary ancestry. So what can we do? Well, we need to make ourselves aware of our fat. We need to establish a feedback loop. The simplest way to do this, and I know this might sound a little silly, but it works, is you take your hand and you touch fat somewhere on your body. Now, what you are doing is achieving basically an external neuronal connection that your brain does not have, or that we don't have internally, to make yourself aware first of the fact that you're not on the verge of starvation. You have enough to survive to the next meal and beyond. Secondly, we can add other convergent elements. We live in a society where aesthetics matters, right? We're living in a society where we don't need to be carrying around excess weight for survival. We give a special value to being thin, right? Where we tend to accumulate fat, the desirable kind of outcome becomes one where we're avoiding that accumulation, especially where it's not conducive to our survival. So I've experimented with this. When you want to lose weight, you touch your fat, like around your waist or wherever you might have a fat deposit. That makes you aware of it, and you can train yourself. Again, it's like establishing an external feedback loop so that you are aware of the fact you're not on the verge of starvation. You're aware of your fat in the way that we don't have the sensory instruments, naturally to be, but our hands, our fingers, the sensitivity of our touch, which again is a rival in sensitivity to our vision. We're using that now to establish a feedback loop that we don't naturally have. I actually call this sort of approach the squirrel. And I've experimented with it where I can go into a market and visit a bakery, and just by sort of doing this slight kind of, again, establishment of an external feedback loop using the sensory organ, the sensory neurons in my fingers to make me aware of my actual circumstance, and that I am not threatened with starvation in a society of abundance where I still have some fat to begin with. So the point is that it is possible to manipulate our neurophysiology, not necessarily by going in and performing molecular biological manipulations, but by assembling a series of ingredients, using the concept of a feedback loop, taking advantage of the fact that we have like a sensitive touch organ, taking advantage of the fact that we are now in a society of abundance, taking advantage of the fact that we're not threatened with starvation, taking advantage of the fact that there is a premium placed on the aesthetics of thinness. We can basically sort of compensate for the fact that we were not engineered for this particular society of food abundance by the device that I've just outlined. I know it now. I'm suggesting that not just as an approach to controlling your food intake and your appetite. It does. You can train yourself so that it does. And I've gone to, like, I've allowed myself to get hungry. I visited bakeries. I've sort of viewed, items that I would otherwise be salivating over, and by just touching my fat and putting a little kind of pressure on it, I've been able to effectively turn off my appetite, and just turn it off because of the external feedback loop that I've created. So that becomes a simple solution based on, again, a number of convergent elements, based on sort of an understanding of our evolutionary past, based on our understanding of our contemporary physiology, based on an understanding of how biology achieves internal controls, of various processes, how we're able to come up with a fairly simple kind of intervention that could in fact have broad consequences. It's an illustration of convergence theory, of adding elements together based upon, what are we talking about? Again, evolutionary theory, understanding of our evolutionary past, understanding of the nature of physiology, of physiological systems, understanding the nature of sensory processes, that we're able to kind of assemble a result. It's actually an illustration of convergence theory. It's an illustration of how we solve any type of problem, by bringing together disparate elements into some coherent way to achieve a particular goal. Okay, now, one thing, there was something else, this notion of, a lot of our lives play out in this arena of need, a sense of what we need, that we need a certain amount of food, or we need a certain type of environmental response. There's a philosophical aphorism I wrote. An aphorism is a concentrated statement. Selflessness, how one acts not out of need. Now, it turns out that from a standpoint of rigor, philosophical rigor, you can't validate a need. You can point to a desire, but a need is something that without which you cannot survive. Well, we can think we have needs, and we certainly assume needs within a heuristic space. And by that I mean, other human beings need oxygen. We assume that we need oxygen. We assume that if we do not have oxygen for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, we're going to begin suffering brain damage. We are going to succumb. But, and I know this is extreme, but philosophy at the limit of rigor, just as religions at the limit of their aspirations, represents an extremity, an extreme response to experience. Rigorously, we can't know. Now, if it sounds like alarming, to sort of posit that, one wants to go back always to the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. Socrates, having been condemned to death by the Athenian court for corrupting the youth of Athens with his teachings, tells his friends, and so we go our separate ways, you to live and I to die, and which is better? Only God knows. Well, if rigorously we can't know whether life is superior to death, that's where philosophy begins, at that level of rigor, then we can't know that we need oxygen. We can know that others have. Now, the point is that within a rigorous space, you are freed from this sense of need that is based upon similarities to others in other situations. But again, those similarities are heuristic and serve to advance our survival in this world as we know it. They do not advance what the limit of rigor does and what the religions aspire to, what we might call our salvation, a complete solution here and now to the problem of mortality broadly. Now, one thing that's interesting about, so this notion of need is something that we kind of have to abandon philosophically. It's something that we can assume for specific purposes of survival. But again, survival only takes us so far. It doesn't take us as far as, again, an extreme solution. Again, the religions call it salvation or enlightenment or whatever extreme term you might want to apply, where We need a definitive solution right here, right now, even to problems of mortality. This notion of need. So there's a Buddhist statement that I mentioned, I think last time or the time before: die while alive and be completely dead, then do whatever you will, all is good. Well, the die while alive part means, among other things, there are various ways to elaborate on that, but it means die to your presumptions, die to your claims that are less than rigorous. That's the only ultimate solution to our circumstances. Everything else is an approximation. Only rigor is an exactitude to our circumstances. Now, I mentioned a while ago that one of the characteristics of living things is that they change the world. To think otherwise, again, is to have this tendency, which is natural to us for reasons based on the fact that language is facilitating our social coordination. And as part of that facilitation, it tends to have us seeing ourselves from the outside as part of a society of equal individuals. It transcends this sort of subjectivity of our experience because we want to be cooperating, coordinating our actions with others. Well, there is no way that a living thing can exist without somewhat modifying experience. There's a basic biological sort of phenomenon called ecological succession. The idea that in any environment, living things, let's say an environment is pristine. Let's say there's no life there for some reason or other. Maybe there's been a catastrophe. Maybe there's been a fire that's wiped out most living forms in that environment. Well, what happens is there's a series of organisms that will begin to populate that environment successively. So first, there may be bacteria. There'll be various types of microorganisms that will enter, that the air will take into that environment. They will begin to convert the environment. They will consume part of the components of the environment. They will begin making waste products. Those waste products will make that environment appropriate for some other life form that was adapted to the use of those results of that first organism's habitation. That second group of organisms that flourishes in that environment, it may be grasses, will sort of change the soil, change the immediate environment, make it suitable for another set of organisms that had previously been adapted to that new set of circumstances. This happens in a series of stages, a progression from an early seeding of life forms that are adapted to whatever that environment presented, in the case of, forest fire, something, charred remains, into what ultimately can become a flourishing forest. So every type of organism changes the world. It changes the world based upon what it consumes. It changes the world based upon what it produces. And primarily what it's producing is waste of various forms. The more such organisms there are, the greater the population of organisms, the greater the degree of transformation. I mentioned a little while ago that at one time, 3 billion years ago or so, the atmosphere on Earth contained effectively no oxygen, contained mostly CO2, carbon dioxide, contained other gases. it was called a reducing atmosphere. The current atmosphere with oxygen is called an oxidizing atmosphere. That original atmosphere did not provide any protection, for example, against the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Life on land wasn't possible because the radiation from the sun was so strong that it would basically disrupt DNA and other molecules and make it impossible for complex systems to develop. The earliest forms of life that transformed the environment significantly were, again, as I mentioned, things capable of photosynthesis, things capable of producing oxygen as a waste product. They were consuming CO2, taking it in, which was abundant in the atmosphere, and generating O2 as a waste product that nobody needed. Well, over time, that transformed the Earth as radically as anything has in the Earth's history. So from an atmosphere that was significantly, substantially, I'm not sure what the actual percentage of CO2, I'm not sure if that's agreed upon, but a substantial percentage of CO2 and no oxygen effectively was transformed into an environment with less than 1% CO2 and 20% or so close to oxygen. A completely different environment. The consumption of CO2 produced the waste of oxygen. Now, what became the fate of that waste product? Well, that waste product became the basis, first of all, for an ozone layer that absorbed ultraviolet radiation from the sun. That ozone layer then became protective against enough of that incoming radiation that life on the solid Earth and near the surface of the oceans could develop, because now it was protected. It had a protective canopy. That oxygen became also available as a consumable product, something that could serve to drive the metabolism and help extract energy from food effectively, that made possible more and more complex organisms, made possible life on Earth, made life on solid Earth, terrestrial, land, and made possible ultimately us. So the concept of living things changing their world and changing it substantially is part of the nature of biology. It's also central to the whole process of evolution. The idea that as an environment changes, it change globally or change locally, it provides opportunities for organisms to arise to take advantage of those circumstances. Now, if you don't want to change a world, then you don't want large numbers of organisms. So one way to deal with some of the issues that human beings are confronting in terms of environmental change, in terms of climate change, is in terms of numbers, right? We have, as our population increases, we are going to have a greater impact on the environment. We are going to change it no matter what. And as we change it, we might change it away from circumstances that allow us to flourish. I mean, again, one of the features of evolution is constant extinctions, because living things change the world. As they change the world, they make it incompatible, even for themselves, to flourish. That's the nature of the process. Now, human beings contribute to substantial types of environmental change in another way, and that's through our technology. Our technology helps amplify substantially change. So we are having an impact on the world because of our, just natural biology, but also, and the numbers that that we inhabit the earth with at the moment, but also, our technology kind of amplifies that change. Nevertheless, we are part of this world, and the technologies that we develop are not alien technology. They're not technologies from outside the world. They are technologies that we develop. One of the things that's extraordinary about living things in general is the internal technologies that they've been able to fashion over time. The idea that you can look at almost any environment on Earth and find living things, because biology turns out to be much more adaptable. Again, it's part of Darwin's observation, than we might otherwise think. But even though we can have organisms capable of tolerating extremes of temperature and salt and just a variety of circumstances, atmospheric pressure, oxygen levels, each individual organism is adapted to a relatively narrow range of circumstances. We, human beings, are adapted to like a temperature range of about 20 to 40 degrees Celsius. We're adapted to a salt concentration in the environment, in water, of about 0.9%. We're adapted to an atmospheric pressure roughly at sea level. We're adapted to levels of CO2, of oxygen, roughly at sea level. Now, we are intelligent creatures, and that is another factor that has to be taken into account in terms of what types of environments we're able to occupy. The French philosopher Pascal noted that early in our evolutionary past, and this is before evolution had been articulated, but you get the sense he was thinking in somewhat, evolutionary terms, the idea that we are frail organisms. When we descended from, now this is not Pascal, but when we descended from trees to the land, we were vulnerable. What made it possible for us to survive was our technology. Pascal's way of putting it is, we as human beings are frail as reeds compared to a lion, a gorilla, other kinds of animals that are adapted to, their environmental niches. But as thinking reeds, we have the capacity to manipulate the world, manipulate the environment to allow us to flourish in a broader range of circumstances. We can build houses, we can protect ourselves against the environment. But still, we are inherently designed, adapted to narrow circumstances. If we, through our activities, through our population, through just living and breathing, if we happen to change the world enough, well, we might change it to a degree that it's no longer compatible, to our survival. That's been more the rule than the exception throughout the history. That's part of life on Earth. That's part of the nature of the process, as, again, Darwin makes clear. Now, I remember one time I turned on a television set to what was the most beautiful seascape I had ever seen. It was the ocean, but it was shimmering. It was like silver, like a mirror. And the edges were multicolored, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was so intensely almost sublime. Well, it turned out to be an oil slick, an oil spill. We change the world in lots of ways. We create lots of waste. We create waste dumps. But a long, long time ago, when I first began writing philosophy, I wrote some short little essays, and in them I talked about how those waste dumps, those convergences of lots of materials, features, elements that had never quite been present before, not in that way, not to that degree, not in those concentrations. Those environments might be giving rise right now to new forms, new life forms, new progressions. You know, we tend to be fairly like narrow and presumptuous in our view of ourselves. Like we are at the acme of creation. We're not at the acme of creation. We are adapted, you know, to certain types of environments, but every given organism is capable of doing things superior to what we can do in relation to their environment. Every organism. Squirrels, again, something that I like to study because it provides access to a mammalian species that I can observe, are capable of climbing trees at 12 miles an hour. That means if they started at sea level, they would be able, in principle, you know, if the oxygen, you know, was adequate, it's not, but it's in principle, to climb from sea level to the top of Everest in half an hour. They have that kind of skill. I first became aware of the fact that as much as we think in terms of our capabilities, our evolutionary development also incorporated specific limitations. And the first time I really, you know, became aware of that was when I saw an early fossil form, you know, a pre-human form where the opposable big toe had just been lost. And it was the first time that it was obvious to me that in our evolutionary advance, we hadn't successively gained function, improved function, we had lost other functions. And I think it's obvious that, you know, eagles can see, you know, more clearly than we can. I mean, every organism is adapted to a niche in which within that niche, it is capable of flourishing and doing things that we cannot do. So, you know, there's an arrogance, right, about our presumed preeminence that is not quite justifiable from a Darwinian point of view, where from the standpoint of Darwin, it's just a matter of what happens to survive and what happens to survive in a given environment, in a constantly changing environment. Changing environments are central to all of Darwin's writing. The notion that the reason that organisms are changing, and he observed change, you know, in his lifetime of species, the reason that there is this constant, we don't want to call it progression, it's really just a change, is that as the environment changes, organisms that were adapted to a previous environment are no longer adapted to a new one. And new organisms that might just happen to arise by chance. Most organisms, most mutations, most changes biologically are by chance. The only ones that are not by chance are the ones that we engineer in the laboratory, basically, or that we achieve by means of like specific, you know, like hybrid mating. You're bringing together organisms to produce a new hybrid form, whether it's with plants or with animals. Otherwise, everything is completely accidental. And it's just a matter of what happens to arise at a particular time. One of the fundamental aspects of evolutionary theory is that it's not directional. It's just accidental. It's like we may survive, we may not. There's no value given to any particular organism or its characteristics. If there's any value at all that we want to assign, it's whether that particular organism is capable of surviving in that set of circumstances, but nothing is going to be capable of surviving in any given random set of circumstances, including ourselves. And as admirable as we may see ourselves, and as potent as we may see our capabilities, there might be greater to come. There might be evolution, beyond what we have seen, what we've experienced. So I always like to go back to the notion that we are presumptive in terms of our needs, presumptive in terms of what we think is ultimately of value, what ultimately will help us. If, as Socrates again emphasized, we can't know that life is superior to death, then we certainly can't know that any specific organism in any specific environment is the ideal, that existence has been moving towards. That's not the view. Biology, as understood, and in terms of, again, the value of evolutionary theory, it's as powerful as theories have really ever been. I mean, it's central now to our understanding of cancer as not as cells basically that are devolved. Like cancer cells have lost their cooperative nature. They are cells that are not as functioning as part of a community of under like strict controls. They've lost those controls. They're not cooperating as part of a community in the organ systems that represent our bodies. They've shed about the last billion years of evolution. They're in a twilight zone between bacterial type cells that are called prokaryotes and our cells and animal cells, plant cells in general, that are called eukaryotes. They're somewhere in between. They don't have the energy capability of most higher organisms. They tend to extract energy the way bacteria extract energy. They have inefficiencies that can be exploited. In a world of biology that's highly competitive, the fact that cancer cells are devolved cells, but that are still carrying with them apparatus of recent evolution that they're no longer making use of, means that they're vulnerable in a competitive environment. They can be stressed out of existence. And that's something that biologists are doing today. That type of approach has already led to a Nobel Prize. So evolutionary theory is powerful, not just in terms of allowing us to gain perspective, on our place in the world. It's powerful in terms of teaching us a certain humility, about our circumstances and about the nature of our circumstances, and the fact that no matter what, we're going to change the world. That's because we cannot leave it and we can't experience it from the outside. But it turns out that because we cannot leave it, because we cannot experience from the outside, because we have to change it, well, those circumstances are linked ultimately to the physics of existentialism, to the work of Einstein and Heisenberg, to the fact that we are singularities, the fact that we exist in distinction to everything else, the fact that we are universal convergences, the fact that we are, again, because we can't leave the world to view it, that we are, so far as we know, rigorously distinct, and that means not subject to whatever limitations others that have come before us may have been subject to. So our situation is open-ended. Our salvation is related to the circumstances that at the same time present the challenges to us. And that's just the nature of our existence. So what is presenting the challenge and what is creating the problem is also the ultimate basis for human salvation within a rigorous philosophic context. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for this intelligent speech. It's been very interesting, and I actually want to like go a little bit back to this like adaptation and everything what you've said. I just remembered recently. Sometimes I do not eat food which I like assume is junk or like that consists of not natural ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents sometimes say to me, well, you have to eat this in order to further our generation to be adapted to these conditions, because it is it's inevitable. So next time, like our next generation will still eat this like natrium, glutamate, natrium, and all these GMO products. So
Yeah.
we have to eat it now in order to our further generations to be adapted to it.
And we don't know the outcome of these things.
Yes.
You know, we literally don't know, and that's also part of the nature of our circumstances. You know, that every situation is unique because every situation represents a new set of convergences, and that's the openness, you know, of experience, where anything in principle becomes possible because every set of circumstances is fundamentally new, different in some way. And any difference could turn out to be the decisive difference, the most important difference that leads to a whole new set of possibilities. I mean, it's André Gide, the writer, the 20th century French writer, once said that it amazed him that people were resistant to change because life is change. That's the essence of it. And if you don't embrace it, you're embracing an illusion, you know, something that's not the reality. And if you try to embrace what's not the reality, ultimately you are going to suffer. So, yeah, so I mean, we have to, I mean, change provides the challenge, but it also provides the opportunity.
Yes, and if the world was static, so we wouldn't be where we are now, right?
That's right. We wouldn't have been born. We would never have come to life. Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's the nature of the experience. And as I said, it all became more clear to me when I read Darwin's Origin of Species. That casts, I think, more light on the relationship of an organism to its world and the change, you know, that takes place, you know, from one generation to the next than any other work.
Yes, and I also wonder, like, if our predecessors and those people and those species who lived like many thousands of years ago, would they survive in the conditions we are now, like in the current conditions?
It's hard to know. And, you know, it's interesting because, you know, the idea of progress, we live with the idea of progress. And that's partly because of the scientific revolution, that science brings us, you know, technology, and every year there's new technology. But that's a recent idea. You know, that only came into existence after the work of Newton. It only came into existence actually in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. Progress was an Enlightenment idea. Prior to the 18th century, people thought the past was superior to the present, that the past was a golden age, that the past 5,000 years ago had produced the pyramids, and that no structure built since the pyramids was as tall and as imposing until the Eiffel Tower was built in the 19th century. So from 3000 BC until almost, you know, the year 2000, for almost 5,000 years, the pyramids were the most impressive human structure. And people thought that those people were far greater, far superior in their capabilities than we were. I mean, even Newton, who created modern science, basically modern physics, thought that he was just rediscovering what Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, living, in the time of ancient Greece, had already known. He didn't think he was coming up with anything new. He thought he was just coming up with what had been previously discovered and then lost. So, this idea of human progress and the ability to cope with, changing circumstances and develop technologies that might be able to address, challenges is very new. It's only a few hundred years old. It's why, like, religions in general saw Eden, or the golden age at the beginning of time, and everything since then as getting progressively worse. And actually, in relation to that idea, the philosopher Wittgenstein was once asked, well, surely, he used, in those days, it was like, 50, 70 years ago, cavemen, people referred to cavemen, early man dwelling in caves. He said, well, surely life is better today than it was in the time of the caveman. And Wittgenstein's response was, well, yes, but the cavemen might not think so. If they were here, because, again, it's like we gain as much as we lose. Right? As much as we gain in technology, we lose in community. We lose in, stability of community. Like, people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, like, grew up, living in the same environment. The people around them were the people that, they would know for their lifetimes. So they had very strong and stable social networks. We, have trouble maintaining relationships more than a few years, right? When we're moving, we're forming new relationships constantly. So we have connections through technology, but a lot of our personal connections are much less stable. So there's a price for change, right?
Yes, but still the technology could bring you to the program of American Spaces, and
well,
we can
yes,
have you.
yes.
So.
I think it's a good thing. Yes, there are definitely good things about it. And I happen, since I'm an only child and I like being by myself, this is good for me, where I don't have to, yes. So I like this. This works.
So
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see each other next week. Hopefully, yes, the internet connection is good and technology will not let us down. And
I hope so too, yes.
Yes, so thank you very much for today's session, and we will wait for our participants next Friday, the same time.
Okay.
Good luck. Have a great day and night.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Yes. See you next week. Bye.